I want to talk some about a man that wanted more. Look at your neighbor and say, do you want more? You may be seated in the presence of the Lord. A man that wanted more. There are some men don't want anything. And because of that, they don't have anything. But in this particular passage of Scripture, we're going to speak briefly on this topic about a man that wanted more. That's interesting. Here is two verses that's recorded in the Bible. Not much, but a lot. That's in these two verses. Just take note of what this man Jabez said and within these two verses. It is that he was introduced as one of the brothers. And he had other brothers, but he stood out amidst his brothers. He was honorable, more honorable than his brothers. There were some things that caused him to be more honorable than his brothers. Looking at his name, first of all, his mother called him Jabez because she bare him in sorrow. And his name meant that he was sorry. I ain't getting nobody in here. Names mean something. And I believe that we should take note of that today when we name our children. Because the name has connotation to really who you are naming. And when we really want our children to start right, then we ought to name them with a good name. But in this case, this mother, obviously she was going through a difficult time at this period. Whether or not it was in giving birth to him, and I believe that it was, that she had a struggle during this pregnancy with Jabez. I don't know how many sleepless nights she had, and I don't know how she perhaps had to get off of her feet. I hear some say that they have to have bed rest. But I'm sure that she experienced a lot of difficulty with this child. And she called his name Jabez, meaning sorrowful or makes sorry. And so he had a negative start when it came down to his name. And I'm sure that throughout the community as a young boy growing up that others talked about him because they knew what his name meant, and I'm sure they just called him, well, here come old sorry. For we saw him last week, and here he comes again, and I'm sure they didn't call him Jabez, they just called him sorry. They knew the name, and so we know how we do so many times, and you know, young people can give others a hard time. I ain't getting nobody in. Yeah, when you grow up through and in a community where young folk will just give you a hard time. And I'm sure everybody, most of you that are in here, had a nickname that someone called you by a nickname. I ain't going to tell you what they call me, but I'm sure that you have a nickname that the children in the community gave you. And it's one thing about a nickname. I moved from South Haven to Memphis, and they called me that in South Haven. And then when I moved to Memphis, the children didn't know what they called me in South Haven, and they started calling me the same thing. and I started to tell you, but I'm not going to tell you. But names, and you growing up, they call you names. And so here was, and the names they call you don't fit you. But it's a negative name that they will call you that you look like. And so whatever they think you look like, they'll call you that. As a young boy, they call Indian, and another one they call Mule, and just so many different names. But here was Jabez. And I'm sure that they didn't treat him right because of his name. The name calling from his brothers and name calling from others that were in the community. But here, he found himself, the scripture says that he was more honorable than his brethren. I believe because he was more honorable than his brethren is because he was an obedient child. He was one that obeyed his parents. He was one that obeyed the teachers in school. And throughout the community, he was one that honored the elderly and respected the elderly. And as a result, his name began to flourish in the community. I ain't getting nobody in here. Whatever we are today, we have made that happen based upon our conduct and our character today. We have made it happen, whether we have a negative in the community or whether we are looked upon as an honorable citizen of our society. I ain't got nobody in here. And so he was more honorable than his brethren, and his mother called his name Jabez, saying, because I bear him with sorrow, pain. And Jabez, another thing he did, he called upon God. He called upon the God of Israel. And he said, oh, that thou wouldest bless me. He knew where and knew who to call upon to get blessed. He says, I want you to bless me indeed. He was not satisfied just being one in the community. He wanted more. Touch your neighbor and say, I want more. He wanted more. He just didn't want to live in this society and let it go by. He wanted more than what those that were around him that didn't have. He wanted more. And the only way that we are going to succeed in this life, we must want more. And when you want more, you know where to go to get more. So Jabez didn't run off leaning to his own understanding. What he did was he looked to God. He began to call upon the God of Israel. If you want more in this life, the more is coming from the God that created the heavens and the earth. Why, he said the cattle on 1,000 hills, it belonged to him. So everything that we desire in this life, we must learn to call upon God. I ain't getting nobody in here. And so he said, he called upon the God of Israel saying, oh, that thou wouldest bless me. How many want to be blessed today? That's men and women, everybody in here. Touch yourself and say, I want to be blessed today. So here was the first thing he did was he called upon God, knowing that all of the help comes from God. And he says, bless me indeed. and enlarge my coast. He wanted his territory to be increased. If you got $100,000, you want 200,000. I ain't getting nobody in here. Enlarge my coast. But most of us, if we got $100,000, next week we'll have $1. Instead of saying, enlarge my coast, I want some multiplication. And so he said, enlarge my coast, and that thine hand might be with me. Jabez did not want anything if God's hand wasn't in it. He didn't want to go anywhere if God wasn't going with him. He didn't want any blessing if God wasn't blessing. And so he looked at this whole thing. A lot of time folk will get things and forget about God. I said they get things and they forget about God. I have known that folk didn't have nothing and they came into the church and they got a job, got a car, and they walked away from God. But here was Jabez saying really what he was saying. Lord, I want you to bless me indeed and enlarge my coast, and that thine hand might be with me. I don't want anything if God is not in it. I ain't getting nobody in here. I said, I don't want anything if God is not in it. I don't want it. That's why I tell folk that the money from the casino, I don't want it. And some folks said, well, you bring all of your tithe in the church. I don't want that cursed money. If God is not in it, I don't want anything that's cursed. You remember Achan? God said, I want you to destroy everything. Don't take nothing. And he went out and got some silver and some gold, and he got all of the valuables, and he hid it in his tent. That was some cursed, forbidden stuff. And whenever you put your hand on some cursed, forbidden stuff, it may look good to your eyes, but God's blessings is not up on it, and you wonder why you're not getting ahead. It's because some forbidden stuff. And so you know the story of how they began to look through the crowds and began to bring all of the tribes in and question them. And when they fell upon Achan, he lost his life and his whole family was wiped out because he had some cursed stuff in his tent. Israel was losing battles. They couldn't win battles with 30-some-odd soldiers. Whipped them, and they had a big army. So what am I saying? That if you do what God would have you do and let God's hand be in your little, he'll enlarge your coast. You can have little in your hand and you can have an enlarged coast with little. And so here it is. He said, enlarge my coast, that thine hand might be with me, and that thou wouldest keep me. That's what this man wanted in wanting more. He wanted God to enlarge his coast, and he wanted God to be with him, and he wanted God to keep him from evil. Look at this prayer that he prayed. He prayed a powerful prayer. And I believe men today ought to pray and pray focused on God. And looking at this model prayer of Jabez, he prayed and wanted more, but he didn't want it without God.